Hello and welcome to Reportage. I am Danish bin Nabi. I am joined by Kalol Bhattacharya, one of the finest authors of the Indian subcontinent. His book, The Great Game in Afghanistan, Rajiv Gandhi, General Zia and the Unending War, throws light on one of the important eras of the Indian subcontinent. The book deals with the Reagan, Rajiv and Zia diplomacy of 1980s, which saw the ultimate withdrawal of USSR from Afghanistan and its dismemberment. Mr. Bhattacharya, the main character of your book is the American ambassador to India, John Gunther Dean. Do you really think that Reagan administration treated him harshly, their own senior diplomat? Did he treated him harshly at the fag end of his career?
Well, you see, the US foreign affairs was shaped in a particular way beginning with the end of the Second World War, because that is when the American diplomats really got into the task of what ultimately became the global superpower. The United States emerged as a truly a real global superpower only with the end of the Second World War. So the generation of diplomats who came with, say, 1947 or 1948 and 1950, or even early 1950s, they were very different from the ones that we perhaps find in the contemporary world, where the profile of the United States is also changed or evolved considerably. What happened in those days was that the American diplomats like John Gunther Dean, who joined the Foreign Service, they also had this sense of mission about themselves as well as the country and the government that they served. So, for example, the United States was also contributing a lot of money for the development and recovery of the devastated parts of the world that were destroyed in the Second World War, especially Europe, and also the colonial areas in Southeast Asia, in Africa. And, remember that United States also invested in the developing countries in the education and administration. So John Gunther Dean came from that generation of diplomats who were particularly assertive. They had an opinionated bent of mind. So wherever he was sent, starting with, say, his senior posts that he began to occupy in 1960s onwards, everywhere he had a sense of mission. He was posted in Vietnam, he was posted in Laos, in Cambodia, Lebanon, then Denmark, Paris, then Thailand and India. So wherever he went, he brought this assertiveness with him. So for the particular administration that came in power in 1980s, that is President Reagan's administration, they were going through these historic changes of the end of the Cold War. So the kind of diplomats that came in the late 1940s were a little bit inconvenient for them. And perhaps that is why they found someone like John Gunther Dean to be inconvenient, and they ultimately, were tough with him and were perhaps unkind with him.
Mr. Bhattacharya, you have also mentioned in your book that the Dean family were particularly against the Israelis, and while he himself was a Jew. Do you think that the Israeli lobby, sting in the US Department, sting in the White House, sting in the US establishment, was also responsible for the treatment he was meted at the end of his career?
Well, I think the United States at that time was going through this election process. You remember by the end of the 1980s, the election for senior George H.W. Bush, that is the father of George W. Bush, he was going through the presidential election mode. And therefore, there were lots of these lobbies that were active in the United States. The Jewish lobby, of course, everyone knows that is very active and has been very active. And that's part of the American political process, in which all lobbies basically compete with each other. And Dean's particular problem with the Jewish lobby was such that, it was a personal matter, because he was a dramatic character, and whoever crossed his path and was not nice with him, he remembered. And he had a fallout with the Israeli state when he was posted in Lebanon in the late 1970s, when the civil war actually intensified in Lebanon. And there was this assassination attempt on him. So he basically held it against the Israeli government because he found out that there was some sort of a link with the Israeli government, that he had done some investigation and etc. And that I think he found that there was some sort of a link, and he held it against the Israelis. But I would not say that the Jewish lobby was responsible for the mistreatment that he ultimately suffered. To me, it appears it was more like a bureaucratic imbroglio that erupted around John Gunther Dean. That was more really, if one really has to look at accountability, and they were more accountable for that mistreatment rather than the Jewish lobby.
According to your account, Dean blamed the Israelis for the assassination of President Zia. Was it really the Israelis behind his assassination plot, or was it because of the animosity Dean held against Israelis? That's why he blamed them.
Well, it was one of the theories, because the assassination of General Zia was never really investigated in a proper, or there was no proper forensic investigation carried out in that particular incident. So I can't really say that who was behind it, but from all accounts, it appears that someone was behind it, and everybody had his or her account of of the villain in the piece. So Dean, for a particular period of time, believed that the Israelis were behind it. But when I met him some years ago before he passed away, he actually told me that perhaps we were involved in it, and then we used to believe that the Indians used to believe that the Americans were involved in it. So there were lots of these contesting streams, and as far as this historic development was concerned, General Zia's air crash was a turning point in South Asian history. So it's natural that there would be many versions to it. So Dean, I had my arguments with Dean on the Israeli aspect, and I used to tell him that since it can be really investigated and proved beyond doubt, so let's move the story forward. And that is why I had taken the story forward and took it into the realm of why the trust network broke down in the late 1980s.
But if we look at the Pakistanis, they also hushed up the matter of Zia's assassination plot. What in your view led to the Pakistani establishment not going ahead with Zia's assassination plot? Why did they not investigate it thoroughly?
Well, the Pakistanis would know better, but it was quite obvious that the Pakistanis wanted to take the relationship forward because their focus was to somehow preserve the relation that they had with the United States, as well as the Americans were also keen that they wanted the relationship to survive this particular traumatic incident. And they wanted to take it forward to the next leadership, whichever was coming. And in this case, it was obvious that the democratic leadership under Benazir Bhutto was coming next. So perhaps they were more focused on recovering the relationship itself and not really finding out the details of whoever was behind it.
In other words, can we say that Pakistanis kept national interest in mind and not the Zia's assassination plot, the investigation about it?
Well, there are lots of accounts about how the Pakistani deep state elements were involved in hushing up the investigation, and there were all sorts of mysterious characters who appeared in certain periods, and certain investigators, even investigative reporters, were also told not to delve deep into that particular air crash, as it was a dangerous thing. So to probe. So I think Pakistanis had good reason not to dig deeper into that account because there were perhaps far more inconvenient truths that were expected to emerge out of that investigation.
Your book talks thoroughly about the period from 85 to 88. 85 to 88, where you say that Americans, Ronald Reagan, Rajiv Gandhi and Zia had held talks for these entire 4 years. They quite diplomacy, the backtrack channels were going on for the broad-based government for the Kabul. However, after the Quiescent resolution was passed by the Americans, which was favoring Pakistan heavily, Rajiv Gandhi backtracked from these talks. Do you think had Rajiv Gandhi persisted for some time with these talks, the entire history of the South Asia would have been different?
Thank you so much. You have really read the book in great detail. it always helps, when the reader has read the text and therefore engages the author. So I would say yes. There was a certain degree of warmth in the relationship between India and the United States, as well as between India and Pakistan. Though there were certain difficulties from time to time because of the Punjab extreme, insurgency at that time, that was also intensifying. But I would say that the relationship with the United States was really critical for India because what happened in 1985, as I have also written, was that the whole high-tech revolution really came to India, where John Gunther Dean himself was involved, and he was involved in the technology transfer that took place to India. So this high-tech transfer began in a very formal manner from November 1985 onwards, and November 1985 onwards. So what happens here on is that your partnership with the Americans was very important for the Indian economy as well. And so it was an all-encompassing relationship, which was truly, therefore, a strategic relationship for India. So what happens here is that when the trust broke down over Pakistan and also Pakistan's quest for nuclear weapons, and it turned out that despite all the back-channel talk that India had, that Rajiv Gandhi had contributed in, the Americans did not really think much before turning towards Pakistan,
Mr. Bhattacharya ji, who broke this trust, the Americans or the Pakistanis? Because the resolution was passed by the Americans, not by the Pakistanis. Obviously, it was favoring the Pakistanis.
No, the trust was it was from the Indian point of view. If you remember, Mr. Gandhi even held some rallies in Delhi over the issue of foreign hand. So it was quite obvious that India's relationship with United States had soured by the end of 1987. When the Kashmir issue had blown up at that time, and there were all sorts of allegations flying in the air about intervention from the American side. There were lots of these espionage activities that had taken place in India, and Rajiv Gandhi was quite clear about emboldening and strengthening India's nuclear sector. Especially, India went for the nuclear submarine from the Soviet Union. So all those things also played against the wishes of the American government. So the Americans perhaps felt that it was okay to cut down India to a particular size.
Mr. Bhattacharya ji, don't you think that Rajiv Gandhi, instead of playing like a politician, he should have played like a statesman and waited for some time so that a broad-based government could be set up in Kabul, and things would have been entirely different for the entire region? Wasn't he in a hurry?
Yes, I would say that once the IndoUS resolution was passed, so it was a complete humiliation for India's initiative, So I would not really blame Rajiv Gandhi for being impatient, because the IndoUS was really the post-Cold War scenario opening up for the American administration. IndoUS was really a landmark, from my point of view, a landmark piece of legislation from the American Congress. So therefore, I would say that after such a resolution came out, there was no doubt that Americans were preparing for a post-Cold War world order in which India's role was going to be limited. So I think he did act in haste, but he did act according to his own understanding.
Mr. Bhattacharya ji, it was perhaps for the first time since the partition that India and Pakistan had come on a same page, and that too on Afghanistan. It was for the first time that both India and Pakistan wanted a broad-based government in Kabul. Had Rajiv Gandhi waited for a bit before sending Natwar Singh to Rome to meet King Zahir, and before inviting Najibullah to New Delhi, before hosting him at New Delhi, don't you think he should have waited again before putting all his cards on the table?
Well, that's in the realm of conjecture. We can always say that perhaps things would have been different, but also we have to look at it in the context of the fact that there was this, gigantic diplomacy happening on the Geneva Accord, which was also taking place side by side. And the Geneva Accord was also falling apart even before it was to be signed. So, that on the one hand, the Indians wanted a peace treaty. the Americans and the Soviets wanted to finish the Geneva Accord, and the Pakistanis were involved in it. Then there are a lot of these back channel players like Armand Hammer and other diplomats who are also involved in it. So one has to really see what Rajiv was trying to do within the context of the bigger games that the bigger boys were playing.
Mr. Bhattacharya, help me in understanding this. How shrewd was Zia? How do you rate him? How do you view his policies in this entire episode of Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I have actually called Zia a victor in my book. In fact, I have referred to the victory that he scored in Afghanistan.
You have called it Pakistan's finest diplomatic victory.
Yes, I mean, it was the finest hour of diplomacy for Pakistan, especially after the vivisection of the country in 1971. So General Zia basically tried to balance India out, and he was able to do it. But it was obviously not just he could do it, but it was also the whole historical play of characters and events and developments that came to a head, and especially the progressive end of the Cold War, which created an opportunity which, to my understanding, he perhaps used to the maximum level. And he became, therefore, extremely powerful for that particular period of time. Perhaps for almost towards the end of his tenure, he became perhaps the most powerful leader from South Asia for a couple of years.
What about Rajiv Gandhi's foreign affairs team? Do you think they could have counseled him better?
Well, India correctly anticipated that the world was going to change with the end of the Cold War. And perhaps there was already anticipation that the Soviet Union would not remain as powerful as it was before during those previous decades. So Rajiv Gandhi's policy was also changing. I mean, if you remember, he went to Iran and he also went to Syria, as I have written. He also opened up to Israel. I mean, he was the first
Prime Minister to open up to the Israelis.
Indian leader, but he was. During that time, he held meetings with the Jewish lobby in New York, and there were secret meetings happening with Israelis. So Rajiv Gandhi was reaching out to all sides in anticipation for the kind of world order that was opening up next.
Mr. Bhattacharya, my last question before I wind this up. You have talked in detail about the Pakistani diplomat Jamshed Markar. How do you rate him? Can you elaborate a bit about his story?
Well, Jamshed Markar, obviously, because since I knew him during his lifetime and I met him on some occasions at his house in Karachi, and I was always grateful. I'm always grateful that he always helped me in my research, and he was always available to answer my questions. He's a great character. He was a great diplomat and a great patriot. Loved his country very, very deeply, and wanted to save Pakistan from the forces of extremism and other such negative forces. He was deeply committed to peaceful relation with India, as well as to building and stabilizing his own country. He was a great character.
But he still failed to build a good relations with India. Am I right in saying this?
Well, the job of a diplomat is to maintain relationship, whether in a covert or overt manner. And during his lifetime, he always maintained the best of relationships with many of his friends in India, as well as in other countries across the world. So he was successful in maintaining his friendship, irrespective of the kind of relation that existed between India and Pakistan. So I would say he could keep his friendships away from the immediate political, circumstances.
Mr. Bhattacharya, thank you and pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much. Please subscribe to our channel Reportage and press the bell icon to remain updated.